Hey art nerds, today we are taking a look at the Mont Marte watercolor set. This is an 18 color watercolor set that was purchased off of Amazon and you guys voted for it, so I hope you guys are looking forward to today's unboxing swatch. Well, you guys voted for this one too, and today we're taking a look at the Monte Marte watercolor set. This was purchased off of Amazon for $12.99, so you guys know it is super primo, but don't let the price fool you. We have reviewed some very inexpensive watercolors that punched way beyond their pay grade as part of the student grade Showdown. But conversely, we've also reviewed a lot of watercolors that kind of cost a lot for how poorly they performed. So this is a 21-piece set. It has 18 pans, 1 palette, 1 sponge, and 1 medium water brush. It comes in a metal tin that I rather like, and it's got the ring on the back. So the English on the back, portable tin, vibrant colors, thumb ring for easy use. We have the colors in this set here on the back. And those colors include Chinese white, lemon yellow, medium yellow, gamboge, cadmium orange, vermilion, scarlet, purple, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, Prussian blue, viridian, sap green, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, Payne's gray, and lamp black. So a pretty standard range of colors. You can see here their URL at Mont Marte Holdings Pty Limited. Mont Marte is a registered trademark of Mont Marte Holdings Pty Ltd. All rights reserved. And then they actually credit the artist who did the art here on the cover, which is impressive. And I have to say, good on you, Mont Marte, for actually crediting your artist. That is surprisingly rare, and some companies will fight tooth and nail not to credit their artists. So down in the description below, I'm going to have all of the links to everything we talk about in this. That's going to be part of my show notes. They have their own website. They also have an Amazon storefront, and they seem to be a budget brand, so pretty on brand for this Showdown. And they sell a lot of different art supplies, acrylics, oils, pouring acrylics, pottering supplies, brushes, easels, seriously, all sorts of art supplies, which makes me sort of suspect that this is another white label company. And their watercolor section is really pretty scant. They've got two types. They've got what we're reviewing here, they've got a metallic version of what we're reviewing here, and then they have a metallic version kind of like the Yatsutomo, almost like a Gensei style poured cake style that I've never really had the best results with, so I'm not taking a look at those. But their watercolor section is mostly watercolor brushes and pencils. Their about page is about as vague as Artesa's, and y'all probably know how I feel about that. I'm not really interested in fluff. I need to know the when, where, and actual why. Like, why are you selling art supplies? What do you want to do that's different from other companies? Why should we give you our money? But when it comes to budget brands, they don't really fuss around too much with that. Mont Marte has 5 levels of quality: play, discovery, signature, premium, and artiste, with this watercolor set falling into the premium range. Are you an artist, designer, illustrator, or art student? Our premium range has you covered with quality art products for every type of project. So I am going to be reviewing this through the lens of a watercolor comic artist, watercolor illustrator, and somebody who teaches watercolors. So basically, we're looking for pretty decent performance. It doesn't have to be professional grade. It doesn't have to be perfection all around, at a price point that I can recommend to students and that they'll find accessible. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I paid about $13 for this on Amazon. There is a metallic set, very similar style, in the same kind of paint box. So enough with that. Let's get to unboxing and swatching the Mont Marte watercolor set. Unboxing this seems to be pretty minimal, which I really appreciate. There's just a plastic belly band in between us and the watercolor palette itself. Inside we have a really pretty minimal watercolor palette. This is actually nice. It has all the pigment information, the lightfast information, the opacity information all in one place. thank you for including this. So many student grade companies do not include this. I'm going to transcribe this so it'll be not in the show notes in the description, but I always provide a Google Doc links with like the full show notes. And yeah, I know I should be doing these as blog posts. I just haven't gotten around to it, but I will. And I will have all this info transcribed for you guys in those notes. So keep an eye out for that. But the palette itself is really pretty minimal. We have our sponge. Don't really use those. We have our water brush. These seem to have become the de facto inclusion in watercolor kits. It's a small travel size water brush. It feels kind of cheap actually. It does not have the little black piece that allows you to carry the top and the water container separately. It screws the opposite way that most Westerners would be used to. So instead of, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, it's lefty-tighty, righty-loosey, if that makes any sense to y'all. The branding on this is really minimal. It's a sticker, an M for medium. Now, what I do actually like about this is, look, it actually fits in the kit. So the half pans themselves are very obviously extruded paints. I mean, they don't even really fit in their containers. Let me see if I can gently pop one out for you guys. It wouldn't surprise me if they used a glue dot to hold this in place. Oh, they did. They used a glue dot, not even gum Arabic, to hold these in place. These are very budget, but that doesn't mean they're absolutely terrible. They're just not that great. I think these are meant to be the additional mixing wells. Really, they're not suitable for much more other than holding some water. I mean, that would be a lot of color to mix, but some people would mix that. Now, my concern is they do say they include a mixing palette. I assume it's the interior lid, which is white enamel. I wouldn't have a problem with it, but as you guys can see, it does not want to lay flat. Now, if the lid was not hinged, then we could remove that and use it as a mixing surface. But as it is, it sits like this. And then finally on the back, this metal ring is actually pretty sturdy. I'm kind of impressed. I never use the metal rings, but this one isn't bad and actually rotates. So I will say their case design is pretty good. This part where it doesn't go all the way back, that leaves a lot to be desired, but this could be an all right set. This could be one of the ones that I actually end up recommending. But enough stalling. They did not include any paper, any pencils, so we pretty much just focus on the paints today, and I'm going to be swatching these on my Blick Studio cotton rag watercolor paper. So before we dive into the swatches, I just want to say a great big old thank you to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Not only do they make reviews like this one possible by providing the funds that I then use to purchase these supplies to review, because we have no sponsors here, and I don't have any partnerships with any art supply companies. I'm a free agent, so all opinions are my own, and they are based on my years of experience as a watercolor comic artist and a watercolor illustrator and someone who teaches watercolor and comics. So that's my background. But if it weren't for my Patreons, I absolutely would not be able to continue to do this. So I really, truly appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Thank you guys so much. Not only does their support go to purchasing things to review, but the consumables that are used when reviewing these things, like said Blick Studio watercolor paper. So a huge shout out to them. Their names are going to be listed at the end of the video. Thank you guys again so much. So let's put those Patreon funds to good use and go ahead and start swatching these watercolors. I'm going to have the pigment and lightfast information down in the show notes for you guys, but the colors in this set are Chinese white, lemon yellow, medium yellow, gamboge, cadmium orange, vermilion, scarlet purple, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, Prussian blue, viridian, sap green, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, Payne's gray, and lamp black. So these watercolors glob up on the brush and muddy the water pretty fast, but the color is pretty clean and vibrant, which is It's a relief, frankly. I've reviewed some really subpar watercolors recently. There isn't really any granulation. Everything seems to be about the same granulation, which is kind of disappointing for me. I like to see that granulation. And already these are a lot better than many of the really cheap watercolors I've reviewed. You can see that they do pollute the water pretty quickly. That's a good indication that there's probably a lot of extenders in this set. The burnt sienna and burnt umber are kind of and the Payne's gray is a bit weird, but the primaries are all really nice and vibrant. And when you really layer them, you do start getting some opacity. We're gonna see how this shakes out later on in the color mixing and the wet into wet test. So while these dry, we're gonna move ahead and start doing our color mixing tests. We have two tests today. We're going to do optical mixing, where we layer one color on top of another to see if we can get a third color. And we're going to be doing atomic mixing, where we basically smash two colors together to get our secondary colors. And if you are new here and you have never watched any of my unbox and swatches, I'm basically gonna be sticking mostly to the primaries, so reds, blues, yellows, in order to make our secondary colors, so oranges, purples, and greens. But I'm also going to try to mix a Payne's gray. Even though we do have a Payne's gray included in this set, I find that Payne's gray is a good test color to see how well these colors actually mix. So for color mixing, we're gonna go ahead and start our grid for optical mixing. And it was pretty easy to find our primaries in this set. It's always a lot easier with these smaller sets. I mean, there's only so many colors in here. You're not really having to guess a whole lot. I would say having a color map with this palette would be pretty handy. I'm going to use the large enameled surface at the top for my color mixing, and I weighed it down with some masking fluid just to hold it in place. Now, unfortunately, the neutrals are really weak, but in general, it was very easy to mix colors, including purples, and you can mix a half decent brown by using the cool red and the cool blue. When they're finished drying, they didn't really dry much more desaturated, so really not too bad. The only real issue is any mix involving the cool yellow, it just doesn't have a whole lot of oomph to it. So the oranges and greens mix kind of desaturated, especially those that include that yellow. It's pretty easy to mix colors with these, and while these dry, I'm going to go ahead and do the wet into wet test, and then I'm going to come back and finish my optical glazing. But you guys can see with the atomic glazing, for the most part, we are able to mix some good colors. They do seem a little bit more desaturated than, you know, in their full force form. So that's definitely something I would keep an eye out for. It's definitely an indicator that if you are really relying on color mixing with these, they may not be as up to the task as some of the other watercolors, but it's not so bad that I'm like, oh, these aren't usable or the field test is going to be terrible. Actually, I feel like the field test is really going to give us an idea of how these handle and what we can expect from them, since we will be painting a full watercolor illustration with that. And that's going to be in another video, but I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I am seeing a little bit of chalkiness over here, but not necessarily anywhere else. So it could also be the type of orange or the type of red that I chose to use there. So for the wet into wet test, I'm still using Blick cotton rag watercolor paper. We have a smaller block here. And what I'm going to basically do is saturate the paper and then throw a bunch of paint on it, let it dry, and see what happens. While my swatch is fully dry, I'm going to go ahead and do the wet into wet test. And these diffuse really pretty, and you can see some granulation or at least sedimentation when adding a lot of water to cotton rag paper. Hopefully these will dry pretty saturated and there's good dispersion in the water. Now, after I let it dry, I did notice that it dried a little bit desaturated, but really not too bad. And there was some really nice color diffusal as well. It gives me hope that the field test for these won't be too painful. And I left it kind of simple because we had such a beautiful rainbow gradient going on here. I didn't want to mess it up by doing too many drip drops of wet into wet, but we're still able to see that the colors are able to mix fairly cleanly and we're not really getting a whole lot of optical brightener going on there. So going back to the optical mixing, these do layer okay, but they're probably not a great fit if you rely really heavily on layering and optical mixing for most of your color work. Most of the layers are a bit polluted and do kind of reactivate the prior layers. Anything involving that cool yellow is trouble. We've completed both the color mixing and the wet into wet test. The wet in the wet test turned out pretty good, actually. I'm kind of impressed by how well these diffused, and we got such a beautiful rainbow gradient that I didn't necessarily want to do the drip drops that I normally do, but I'm not really seeing any scaling or any harsh whites or any kind of white halo. Maybe a little with the purple, but I mean, you guys tell me. I don't think so. It's not as saturated, as I would have really liked, but it's not bad at all. And it leads me to feel that maybe the field test won't be so bad after all. And our atomic color mixes have dried, and they actually dried a little more saturated than I'd expected. When they were drying, while they were still a little wet, they desaturated a little bit, and I was concerned that they would continue to desaturate as they dried out, but no, they kept a lot of their saturation. In fact, the only one I'm kind of concerned about is the one made with the cool yellow and the cool blue. The cool yellow just seems really desaturated for what it is. In fact, it is the problem child here in the family. You guys can see here with the glazing that it is both very weak in terms of having color, but fairly opaque. So we are able to glaze these, although there is some reactivation. So that is something you're gonna wanna kind of keep in mind as you're painting. So what we have left is the lift test, and then we're going to compare the Monte Marte watercolors to some of the other watercolors that I've talked about in the student grade showdown. And that'll give you guys kind of an idea of whether they're worth your time and money, or if you should get one of those instead. And then finally, we'll talk about the pros and cons, and we'll come up with a verdict as to whether or not, just based on this unboxing swatch, the Monte Marte watercolors are the right watercolors for you, your needs, and your budget. These paints have varying degrees of liftability, which is actually really good to see because different pigments are going to have different staining properties, and that tells me that the binder isn't playing a more prevalent role in how these paints handle than the actual paints themselves. So that's honestly really refreshing to see. Okay, so how do the Mont Marte watercolors compare against some of the other watercolors we've reviewed as part of the student grade showdown? Well, this isn't all inclusive. I still feel like the Malayang pigments, the Pretty Excellent, the Parrot watercolors that I reviewed way at the start, those are great. And I still feel like the Superior folding palette is better. So both of those are better, but what I wanted to kind of talk about is watercolors that are either in the same price range or reminded me of the Mont Marte watercolors. So these look a lot like the Sakura Koi watercolors. They're a little bit stickier. I think they're using a different binder. They might even have some glycerin in them because they're really pretty sticky and they've had a chance to dry for a little while. So they sort of remind me of the Xylee W watercolors, mostly because they're a similar price point, but also they are very much extruded watercolors in a thin plastic tray. So here is the wet into wet for the Xylee W, and here are the swatches. The Mont Marte is much more saturated than the Xylee W. I'd be interested in trying out a larger palette of the Mont Marte or whoever they're white labeling them from. If they offered a 24 or a 48, it'd be neat to try those out as well, and then I could a little bit more directly compare them against some of these larger palettes. But I think the Mont Marte watercolors are better watercolors than the Xylee W by a long shot. It's almost the same palette size. This is 18 pans, this is 12 pans as the Arteza palette. Both of them come with a water brush. I will say I think the Arteza water brush is a little bit nicer than the Mont Marte set. Also, the palette that the Artezas come in, these are pretty standard palettes, you know. You'll see this kind of palette a lot, but I actually think the Mont Marte watercolors are better than the Arteza watercolors, particularly when we did the wet into wet test. So you see we're getting a lot of color ins, even though it was done wet into wet. They should nicely diffuse the way the Mont Marte did, but they don't. There's a lot more optical brighteners, I think, in the Arteza set than in the Mont Marte set. And the Mont Marte set is not as expensive as the Arteza set. And while I don't love this plastic tray, it's not my favorite. I do like the metal tin. I think the metal tin is actually really well designed and very sturdily built. It also kind of reminds me of the Giorgione, slightly more expensive palette. This is the $13.99 palette, so they're in a similar price bracket. This is a 48 half pan watercolor palette, so you do get a lot of color with this, but all that color is really not that saturated. I would say that the Mont Marte watercolors deliver a bit more saturation than the Giorgione watercolors. I would also say they handle wet into wet diffusion and blending a little bit better than the Giorgione, so I like them better. And then finally, we have the Shapiro Farben, and I do not have my swatches on hand for this, but I do have the Shapiro Farben field test, and I will include that so you guys can check that out. But I would say they're probably comparable in my eyes to the Shapiro Farben set. I bet you guys are getting kind of tired of seeing this Shapiro Farben clip, but it's really helpful because I don't actually know where that palette is, and it allows me to demonstrate the palette and how the palette handles in a real world situation. So I've talked about the Shapiro Farben watercolors a whole lot, and they're kind of my de facto example of they handled so much better in the field test than I really expected them to. And they're the reason, even if I'm getting like bad vibes from some of these paints, I'm still gonna put myself through the field test, because sometimes the only way to know if watercolors are any good is to actually sit down and try to paint an illustration from start to finish. I mean, that's how I figured out that the Mia watercolors were just not a good fit for me at all, was trying to paint something and just completely flubbing it. So the Shapiro Farben watercolors handled a lot better than I expected them to, and I hope you guys will check out that review in the future. So what are the pros and cons for the Monte Marte watercolor palette? Well, the pros are the carrying case is pretty nice and fairly distinct. This isn't just some mass-produced case that, you know, every other company is currently carrying. This is something that definitely looks like a Monte Marte watercolor case, and that carries more weight than you'd think. The pigment info, lightfast info, and opacity info were all listed in the palette in this plastic insert that I have misplaced, but I appreciate that they did include that because so many student grade palettes, you cannot find the pigment information, lightfast information, or even opacity information for love or money. Like, they will not tell you. We saw that with the Arteza palette. So the fact that the Monte Marte watercolor palette was willing to be very forthright with that really kind of bodes better for these paints, especially because I didn't really have high expectations for these. The lid of this tin can be used as a mixing surface, and it also comes with removable mixing wells, which makes it work quite well as a Plein Air watercolor palette. It's also pretty inexpensive, so this actually hits quite hard for such a cheap palette. It's also fairly compact. You could slip it into a bag or a purse quite easily. If you're wearing women's pants, though, it's not going to fit in your pocket, but if you're wearing men's pants, it might fit a little bit better there. And the Plein Air loop on the back is actually really well constructed, and it swivels quite easily. I was really pretty impressed with how well this is built. So what about the cons? Well, the neutral browns are really weak and desaturated. If you like to paint animals or landscapes or hair or people, you might struggle to get the color you want with this formulation. The construction of the tin sort of prevents you from using the lid as a mixing surface unless you find a way to weigh it down. You guys saw me do that with some masking fluid. It could be more compact, but a lot of the space is kind of wasted with the mixing surface. The half pans are extruded little chiclets, and they're held in by a glue dot to a really flimsy plastic liner that's definitely gonna get brittle over time. So this setup here is very, very, very cheap. And the way the set is laid out, it doesn't have a lot of reusability value, but you could easily just gut the whole thing, keep the tin, and use magnets and half pans to keep your paints in place as you outgrow the set. So that actually, if I decide I'm done with this set, I might just gut it and keep the tin because you can fit a fair number of half pans in it. Let me remove the liner just to show you guys. This would be kind of a, oh, that is a color that I was not expecting. I think that's grease. Sorry, that took me by surprise. Anyway, this is gonna cause some problems with half pans, but you could put half pans in around it and utilize it like that. So looking at it, it's actually probably the cerulean blue, and like this little metal ring might have cut through. So that's another design flaw, because you don't want your paints leaking underneath this thin, inexpensive, flimsy plastic liner. So there's definitely some serious pros and some serious cons about the Monte Marte watercolor set. So of course, the only way I'm going to be able to give you guys a final verdict is after the field test. So hopefully you guys will stick around, consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification so that you don't miss updates when YouTube updates. But I have been told by several subscribers that YouTube doesn't bother to let them know when the channel updates. If you enjoy my content and you want to make sure you don't miss it, you can follow me on Patreon. So there's a difference between pledging and supporting my Patreon and just following the page. Following costs you absolutely nothing, and you'll get my weekly backer update, which is open to the public, and that's where I list everything that went live that week, including the stuff that went out to patrons only. So that's a good way to kind of find out what you're missing out on. But it does list all of the videos and some of the Twitter threads. When I do Twitter tutorials, I list those in the backer update as well. So that's a good way to kind of keep up with what I'm doing. So my verdict for the Monte Marte watercolor set, it's not bad. This set performed a lot better than I was expecting, and I'm hoping it does well in the field test. It's one of those on the fence sort of sets. It seems promising, and hopefully it lives up to it. So who is this set for? I feel like this set could be a great inexpensive gift or stocking stuffer for a younger artist, someone looking for an inexpensive watercolor set for travel, or someone looking to play around with watercolor. You get 18 colors. They activate fairly quickly, but they are very obviously student grade, and once you kind of run through these colors, there's no refills, and really in order to really utilize this set time and time again, you would need to gut this set, but it seems pretty easy to gut this set. So that's why I'm kind of like, I normally really don't like the cheap plastic liners with the extruded paint with no refills. That's usually bad news for me, but the tin itself is quite well made, and there's some really easy ways that you could jerry-rig this into something that you can use for longer. So that's why I'm not being so hard on this set. All right, guys, that was the unboxing swatch for the Mont Marte watercolors. This 18 color set has a lot of pros and a lot of cons, and only the field test is really going to give us an idea for how well this pocket-sized set handles. One thing I really like this set though is the sturdy construction of the tin itself, but I also appreciated that they gave us pigment information. So few student grade brands are willing to give us pigment grade or pigment information. So these are the swatches for all 18 colors, plus our color mixing, both optical and atomic. And then here is our diffused, beautiful wet into wet test. And this set handled a lot better than I expected, but the proof is in the pudding, and we're only gonna know for sure when we do the field test. So hopefully you guys will subscribe and stick around for that. I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and informative. One of the things I really like about the set is it's particularly accessible. It's a very inexpensive watercolor set that actually handled surprisingly well, and that's very much in line with my goal of helping you guys make art a habit. And one of the ways we can do that is to kind of demystify the art process, demystify the supplies, and share inexpensive but good art supplies with you guys. So hopefully this one has been a treat for y'all. I sure enjoyed it. I definitely needed a win after several not so great products. So I hope you guys are enjoying the student grade showdown. If you guys are looking for more art tutorials and reviews, make sure you check the homepage because I've got all these great playlists listed for you guys, and check the description below for additional videos as well as the show notes and links for this video. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons for their continued support. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day and remain safe, happy, and healthy. Bye guys.